Hello, this is Dr. Flight, and this is the concept evaluation and test segment, part 2. And specifically, what we're going to talk about is the construction and the launch of a concept test. As we move forward, we want to talk about doing concept testing and the specific instrument that we'll use when we do concept testing. But just as a simple review, we want to remember that concept testing is something that we're going to do to eliminate poor concepts as they move forward. This will also be an external concept test, so we're going to be talking to the market and consumers. So we want to be able to, at least in a very crude sense, get an estimate for anticipated sales and more specifically the rate in which people would try our new product. This is going to be a market research type of a tool that we use. The other thing that we can do as we're evaluating the product and having consumers think about it is we can look at different parts of the product and be able to make changes and modifications so that we can refine the product into something that is beneficial, more beneficial to the customer, or something that they would rather prefer to have. So as this is market research, we're going to be doing surveys or interviews typically of our market of consumers who will use the product. One idea is that when we communicate what our product is, we need to be able to communicate it in a clear and unambiguous fashion if we can. So if your product is associated with an emotion or a feeling or some type of a sense, those are typically pretty difficult to communicate unless you have the person and the actual product in the same room and they're working together and the people are evaluating it in person. So if this is going to be done by a survey or an interview, some type of a concept test like that, then products that focus on some type of a personal sense, like a taste or an aroma, those are difficult to incorporate. Emotions, concepts that deal with art, entertainment, those are difficult as well. Products that are radically different or radically new and involve technologies that the customer really has trouble understanding, they're not going to be able to give you a very clear idea of whether they'll buy the product if they don't understand the product. So new technologies that the consumer can't visualize often are a problem. Also, products that we ourselves have trouble describing, so we call these fuzzy, like the fuzzy front end, fuzzy ideas, or ideas that are difficult for us to describe. It's going to be hard for us to perform a concept test. Or if customers simply don't know about a problem that they have, and so this new product's going to relieve a problem that they don't even know that they have, it may take some consumer awareness building before you can even get to the stage where you can test the actual product idea out. So you think back in time, people didn't know how great an amusement park would be. Coney Island had the very first moving train or roller coaster. Actually, the idea of it. But what about the Ferris wheel? How would you know how great a Ferris wheel was if one didn't exist? And how would you describe the feeling that you'd have to a customer and then ask them whether they would use it or not? Or the first microwave, because the technology was so very innovative, people would be very skeptical to use a microwave and trust that its effects would be as good as a traditional oven without actually trying it and using it and being experienced with it first. So concept testing, again, we're asking people to think about an idea and then judge whether they would buy the idea or not in the form of a product. So if you can't communicate the idea, or if the idea is very vague or far-fetched for the consumer, they're going to have trouble figuring it out. Okay, so as we think about concept testing externally, outside of the firm, this is going to be a market research type of a process. So in market research, what we typically do is have a series of steps that we take to conduct a research study or try to find out information from the marketplace. So just as you would in market research, you'd have a series of items or thoughts that you want to put down as you go through the process and then analyze the data that you have. So this is going to begin with preparing what we call a concept statement. We want to be able to, in words, describe the product idea that we're going to launch or that we're going to test in the marketplace. We want to clarify the specific purposes of the research, but also of the product, like why the product exists. We want to decide on the format that the actual survey or the test or the concept test will take on. So like how will we describe the product and so forth. And then we want to go through a series of these other steps. We want to determine our respondents. We want to be able to control the testing environment. We want to be able to actually launch the survey and tabulate results and so forth. So again, there's a series of steps here that in any type of research you typically do. So this is going to be like a research instrument that we design and we create specifically for the purpose of testing and measuring the likelihood that someone will buy our product. Okay, so moving forward then, some key issues in concept testing involved first and foremost the concept statement. So what we'll do is we'll actually use words and we'll describe what the new product is in a very descriptive type of a way. Usually this is in a written narrative. Occasionally there'll be a drawing or some type of an illustration that shows what the product looks like in addition to the narrative. And in some cases, we may even have some type of a model that the customer could hold if this is a face-to-face type of an interview where they're evaluating the product in person. That's not required, and it's akin to having a prototype. So you don't have to have a prototype, you don't have to have a working model, but sometimes that's helpful, especially if the product is really, really new to the world, something that you think the consumer is going to need to be able to hold. The respondent groups, we often look for people who are our first users or the innovators or who we call the lead users. So those people, those consumers who would typically buy our product first, we often look to them first to do some of this research. We also think about like where and how we're going to launch our research instrument. So how will we get a hold of our sample? How will we get a hold of our lead users? Where will they conduct where will they complete the survey? Will they do it at home? Will they do it in a laboratory? Where exactly will they be? We want to think about in specific detail the process or the research process that we'll walk through, or the protocol is sometimes what we call it. We want to make sure that the concept statement that we wrote, the narrative that we wrote, is understandable, that it's believable, whether this product, if we can stress the importance or the value that this product would have in meeting some unmet need, and so forth. Okay, so much of this is like typical research protocol that we would want to do whenever we're gathering data, but the purpose of this whole process is to evaluate a product concept and to decide whether we should move the concept forward or not based on how well the customer market receives the product and how well they think of it. So the last item here is the test procedure. Again, and the study results and findings, how we'll wrap up the procedures, how we'll actually execute the research study, gather the data, and maybe do some statistical work on the data, and then move forward to be able to make a decision. The first step, though, in all of this is creating a concept statement. So that first and foremost is the most important part of what we'll do moving forward. The statement that's made will be, again, it'll be a written statement that talks about what the product will do. We might talk about its form or the technology used in it that will yield specific benefits to the customer, and you can illustrate or demonstrate in the narrative how these new benefits are better than some other product that already exists out there. So you do want to make sure you're clear to the customer why this product is different and maybe why it's better in certain product features than what they are currently using to satisfy their needs. So here's an example of just a one sentence phrase that would be the beginning of a product concept statement. So this is a new electric razor whose screen is so thin it can cut closer than any other electric razor on the market. So this describes this as an electric razor, and there's a key benefit here that is provided by the technology of a super thin screen. So the benefit is that you get a closer shave by using this razor, but that close shave is achieved by the thinness of the screen, which is the technology or the resource or the part of it that's different from what other companies can offer. Okay, as we're writing this statement and we're describing the product in a narrative, and this is just a one sentence narrative, you can continue on and you can have a much longer narrative if appropriate. But a couple key points to remember. There's this idea called commercialization in a narrative. One of the things that you want to try to strive for is your narrative to be written so that it does not sound like an advertisement. So the commercialization versus the non-commercialization of the concept statement is like how much the verbiage sounds like an advertisement motivating somebody to buy. So a non-commercialized concept statement, which is generally what we want to shoot for when we're writing these things, has just the facts and just the statistics and just kind of as truthfully written as possible, an explanation of what the product does and how the product can benefit the customer. A commercialized statement is sometimes thought of as an embellished description, and it sounds like the way the product would be promoted or advertised. In concept testing, we sometimes use both as an illustration. So the customer will see a commercialized concept statement generally in an ad, and we know that we want to motivate the consumer to think about buying the product. The challenge is we don't want the data to be overstated because the product description is too commercially embellished or too descriptive or too over the top. What we want is a true and accurate measure of whether the consumer would buy the product or not. But if you're not, if you have absolutely no commercialization or no discussion of the benefits of the product and so forth, then the consumer may just be left flat and they might not really see why they should buy the product. So a lot of times we'll have a mixture of commercialization, but we want this to be as realistic as possible so that the data is not overstated. That's probably the biggest mistake that we can make, is gathering data and then not accounting for the fact that consumers are just making statements that they would buy the product when they wouldn't as a result of some over commercialized wording that's contaminating the actual results that we get. So a compromise is something that we can do when we start to write the language for the concept statement. A gentle sell keeps it simple but doesn't oversell the concept. So being able to compromise in that sense is a good thing to be able to do. We don't want to mix multiple concept statements in one test if desirable, so if possible. So if we have a lot of different product variations or versions, We typically would like to have separate concept statements for each product version without mixing and matching different features or doing too much to confuse the consumer. The more options the consumer has, the more like if we offer different price points and things like that, those are going to oftentimes just confuse the customer rather than be something that they can think of and really focus on. If you have too many different versions of the product, like a large, a medium, and a small version of the product, and you try to test all three at the same time, that can cause a problem for the consumer. So keeping things simple is always the best case when we start to think about product concept tests. We also, again, want to focus on our level of technology in terms of like how technologically advanced the product is, and making sure that we're not confusing a simple product line extension with some radically new product. So being clear about the specific product is just think about, you're talking to an audience here, and you want to make it as simple for them to understand and as realistic for them to think about so that they can evaluate whether they would buy the product or not. Here's an example of a concept test that may or may not be so great in terms of the narrative. So the narrative says, here is a tasty sparkling beverage that quenches thirst, refreshes, and makes the mouth tingle with a delightful flavor blend of orange, mint, and lime. It helps adults, and kids too, control weight by reducing the craving for sweets and between meal snacks. And best of all, it contains absolutely no calories. Comes in 12-ounce cans or bottles and costs 60 cents each. So here's an example of a narrative, and clearly this narrative is a commercialized narrative. It may overstate the benefits of the product, and as a result, people who read that are very likely to try it, or at least say they would try it. And that would potentially overstate our data. We have two different questions that are asked here. How different, if at all, do you think this diet soft drink would be from other available products now on the market that might be compared with it? So this is a measure of how distinctive or different its characteristics might be. Again, we're going to have some difficulty with this type of a test because we don't know whether the consumer sees it different on its ingredients or the size of the can or the cost of the can or the product and so on. So there are lots of attributes being described, and we don't know which attributes the consumer feels are different from competitors. So that's a bit of an ambiguous question, and the data that's received can be useful, but it might be a little bit difficult to interpret. The second question asks that if they tried the product, how often would they continue to buy it? So frequency of purchase or repeat purchase rate is something that we get there. This is actually the second question can be used. And the big assumption, though, is that it implies that they will try the product to begin with. Again, the interpretation of the data on this is going to be very vague. It's going to be a little difficult to make a clear interpretation of this particular concept test. Another concept test example is for our aerosol hand cleanser. This has a narrative, so there's a narrative here that describes the product, but then there's also an illustration here as well. So an illustration kind of showing how the product might be used can be included as well. And then we have what we call the classic intention to purchase item down below, which is a single item question asking whether somebody would buy the product or not on a Likert-like scale. From definitely would buy all the way to definitely would not buy. So the verbiage here for the narrative says a large size can of hand cleanser concentrate that completely eliminates those lingering unpleasant odors that come from handling fish, onions, garlic, furniture polish, etc. Not a covering odor, just press the button and spray directly on the hands and rub for a few seconds. And then you rinse off in the faucet. It's a 24-ounce aerosol can and it can last for months. It costs $2.25. All right, so this is the narrative. It is not particularly commercialized. But it does describe the product features and how the features can benefit the customer. It describes the size of the container and the cost of the container. So price is included there on that particular one. This is probably going to yield a fairly good result in terms of the data. Moving forward, and again, it kind of blends the non-commercialized versus commercialized language together in probably a pretty effective way. Okay, so again, I can't stress enough that we're doing market research here. So the verbal description that we could use a drawing, we could use a diagram or a sketch to help illustrate what we're talking about. But we need to make sure that the narrative and the language is very clear, that it doesn't use a lot of really big words. We don't use double negatives. 8th grade reading level is typically what we want to see on this type of a test, like any market research. We clearly want to identify the determinant attributes or the features of the product that set it apart from other products that are already out there. I want to make absolutely clear why this product is better or different than the competitors. Once you start saying why it's a whole lot better, then you become a little bit too commercialized probably, but you want to make sure that you clearly identify why the product is different. We want to be realistic, we want to be credible, and we want it to be fairly short. It does not need to be more than a page or two or anything like that, something that the customer can read, understand, conceptualize fairly quickly, and then move on from and be able to answer that very, very important intention to buy question. And sometimes we'll have an intention to buy question, and then following that we'll have a frequency of purchase question like there was in the first narrative example. So we'll typically have an intention to buy question first, and then we'll ask them how frequently you would buy this type of product. Or we'd ask them currently, how frequently do you buy this type of product? And we may even ask them who they, what their current, who they currently buy from now, or their current brand that they use. So you can gather a little bit more information beyond that, but the concept test deals specifically with that initial intention to buy question. As I've mentioned, we use drawings, diagrams, and sketches. There is the possibility of adding prototypes or models. Again, as you can imagine, this is going to be expensive to create a prototype, but if you have a product that's associated with senses or feelings or emotions of some type, or if you need the customer to actually hold and feel and try the product out, then you may have to have a prototype of some form, and you may have to have them come in and actually try the product out. A variation of a prototype, which is possible now, especially in the digital world, is using virtual reality. So virtual reality is certainly a tool that can be used and is used where someone might have a VR type of a headset, but realtors use these all the time now to describe and show a potential house. Virtual tours, for instance, architects can use this as well. Some other notes as we start to wrap this up. We mentioned this idea of commercialization, so certainly should be familiar with this idea of what commercialization is all about in the language of the narrative. Some people often ask if they should include competitive information, and this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because when you start to introduce a competitor, you automatically have some basis of comparison that the customer will start to look at, and it it brings up a competitor, and that might distract, or it may create what we call a halo effect of some type, where the consumer taking the survey thinks about the competitor, and they either really like the competitor or really don't, and they base their judgment of your product on how they feel about the competitor. So it may not be a great idea to provide competitive information, especially by name, like brand name specifically. However, you do need to describe how your product is different from other products already out there. So if you can describe other products that are out there that your product would be similar to, and describe how your product is different and it's set apart from the others. If you can do that without mentioning a brand name of your competitor, it's probably the best thing to do. But again, some people will use competitive information, others won't. It's kind of a judgment call on the part of the researcher. Final note here is whether price should be included or not. And yeah, generally price should be included in the narrative because it's a product feature. It's a product attribute. So, generally speaking, we include the price, and price is going to be a big impact of on whether somebody decides to buy the product or not. So it's a comparative feature. It helps place the product in context. Price also signals quality. So certainly I would include price whenever I did a narrative like this. One technique you can incorporate is by having multiple concept tests. You could have a concept test, for instance, for the product set at one price, and then you could have a second concept test that's developed that has the same narrative and the same description, but you could set a different price, like one that's maybe 10% higher or 10% lower, and then from that you can estimate the difference in demand as a result of the difference in price. We're going to use this later on, actually. So when we're measuring price elasticity of demand, this is one of the techniques that we'll do, is we'll have two different versions of the concept test or more. And what we'll do is we'll vary the different attributes, specifically price, and we'll be able to look at the change in demand as a result of a change in price, which is how we define price elasticity of demand. Okay, so absolutely include price on this, and we'll move forward. So to wrap up, we talked about concept test processes and the cautions that we specified what a concept statement is like, and specifically the narrative that is associated with a concept test. We also talked about the structure of doing some market research and specifically launching and engaging in the concept test.